All right. Good morning, everyone. Uh, it's a real pleasure to welcome you here at Hillwood. It's wonderful to see both familiar and new faces here in this theater on a Saturday morning. My name is Wilfried Seisler. I'm the Deputy Director here and Chief Curator. And as we begin, I would like to take a moment to gratefully acknowledge the Nakotchenk, also documented as the Anacostion, the Piscataway, and the Pamumki. These are the native peoples on whose ancestral lands we stand, as well as the diverse and vibrant native communities who make their homes near us today. We are really pleased to have partnered once again with James Renwick Alliance for Craft for this program today, which is part of their Distinguished Artist Series. And this program is also, so it's a real partnership, part of our lecture series organized around our current exhibition, Fragile Beauty, Art of the Ocean, which I curated. Courtney Mattison is one of the wonderful artists featured in this exhibition, and I have to say I cannot wait to hear more about her work and about how her creation resonates with our theme developed in the exhibition. We will also have time in the exhibition today, so there will be time to, answer additional questions in the space in front of the artworks displayed in the exhibition. And as you can imagine, there is a whole program around the exhibition that is coming up. So on November 7th, there is a presentation, a talk by myself on the exhibition and around the concept. And if you want, on later in November 15, if I'm not mistaken, there is a wonderful lecture on pearls by Francesca Cartier-Brickell. It's sold out, but you still have an opportunity to register for an online participation on this wonderful upcoming program. You can register after this talk at the desk. You can go online, hillwoodmuseum.org, and you can also become members if you are not yet members. So as I mentioned, there will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and then Katie and Leah will actually give some instruction to see how to divide the groups, how we will go with you to the exhibition space to explore further, and for us to be on station, Courtney and myself, to answer all the questions you may still have about the show. So it's now my pleasure to pass the mic to Rebecca Ravenel, President of the Board of the James Renwick Alliance for Craft, who will tell us more about the organization and Courtney Mattison. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much. As Wilfred said, I am Rebecca Ravenel, the board chair of the James Renwick Alliance for Craft. And by the way, we are a membership organization also. So if you are not already a member and you enjoy this program, please go on our website and you can see all the other fantastic programs we have coming up. The JRACraft mission is to foster appreciation, connoisseurship, and support for American craft, and we do that through a robust series of trips, talks, tours, and other events. We're so happy to be co-presenting this program today with Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens in conjunction with their stunning exhibit, Fragile Beauty, Art of the Ocean. I'd like to thank the team at Hillwood, including Kate Markert, Wilfred Zeisler, and Katie McCarthy. Today I'm here in my role as chair of the JRACraft Distinguished Artist Series. Several times each year we bring a notable American craft artist to give presentations. Each artist gives 2 presentations highlighting different aspects of their career and influences and their creative techniques. We're delighted to be presenting Courtney Mattison today, a ceramic artist and ocean advocate who seeks to bring awareness through her grand-scale installations of the urgent need for protecting these beautiful life forms. She travels the world teaching her important message through her impressive artworks. Please welcome Courtney Mattison.
Thank you all so much for being here. It's exciting to present my work at Hillwood, and I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then I'll leave time for some questions at the end. For those of you who tuned into my virtual talk for JRACraft on Tuesday, thank you. Hopefully this isn't too repetitive. I promise it's different, but the beginning may sound a little bit familiar. Life on Earth wouldn't be possible without water. Water is what we look for when searching for other planets that might be as hospitable to life as Earth is. There's a renowned oceanographer and National Geographic Society explorer at large named Dr. Sylvia Earle, who says, "No water, no life, no blue, no green." And she's also fond of saying that without water, we'd have a planet a lot like Mars. The ocean, which covers over 70% of Earth's surface, connects us all, from the deep mesophotic coral reefs to the Philippines, the coral reefs of the Philippines to the icy peaks of the Rocky Mountains. And because we're all connected to the ocean, our actions, the carbon dioxide we emit, the materials we waste, the fish we eat, all have an impact on it, no matter where these actions occur. I deeply believe that art can help shape our path towards more wholehearted actions and policies for marine conservation. In my art practice, I combine my backgrounds in marine conservation biology and ceramic sculpture to inspire social change, policy change, and translate concepts from environmental studies into sculptural installations and objects in an attempt to bring the beauty and fragility of life in the ocean above the surface and into view. Coral reefs have really captivated my imagination for as long as I can remember. And I'm really happiest when the exotic forms and vibrant colors and often venomous appendages of the animals that inhabit a tropical coral reef kind of dance through the window of my scuba mask as I slowly hover above, or in some cases behind. That's a Napoleon wrasse that I met in Australia named Wally. I got scuba certified right after high school in 2004 and got to experience shrinking down, kind of sinking among the colorful coral living on the reef for the first time. And I remember hovering among them and feeling like I was exploring an alien universe. By that time, I had already taken my first marine biology class in high school in San Francisco, and I had also already begun sculpting corals and other marine invertebrates from clay. So this is kind of a weird set of photos from my high school experience, but old pictures. But already by then, I was combining art and science in a way that felt completely natural to me, and I only realized later was pretty unusual and eccentric. So I'm lucky to have had really inspired teachers that supported me to explore those passions. When I started freshman year at Skidmore College, I knew I had to combine these eccentric interests in marine biology and sculpture, and I immediately started working with my advisor to develop an interdisciplinary major that we called a self-determined major at Skidmore. And as a side note, the thesis title for my senior project was Fragile Beauty, so I'd like to think that inspired the title of the exhibition here. I spent about 9 months in Australia studying abroad at James Cook University in Queensland, studying coral reef ecology and reef fish biology and taxonomy on the Great Barrier Reef. And I fell really head over heels in love with coral reefs while I was there. They're these faceless, tiny plant-like animals that essentially sculpt. They're the architects of some of the world's largest living things, and I think that idea is really fascinating. So it's been my goal to visit as many healthy coral reefs as possible since then. Since those early days, my interest in the world of marine science has led me to some really amazing places, and I've been really fortunate to experience the fragile beauty and the wildness of the ocean beneath the surface. I've worked with Dr. Sylvia Earle's organization, Mission Blue, to organize marine science expeditions all around the world, from the Norwegian Arctic to the Mediterranean and the Galapagos, where we've supported scientists to do important research. A little video. In 2019, another nonprofit called Oceanic Society invited me on an expedition to Raja Ampat in Indonesia for their Blue Habits project. And we created a short film about my work, and this is just a clip from it, to raise awareness about coral reef conservation. So you can watch the full video on YouTube. But that's just one of 8 trips that I've made to Indonesia since 2016. It's home to some of the healthiest and most diverse and vibrant coral reefs on Earth, and scientists often call it the Amazon rainforest underwater for that reason. It's just an exceptional place. And I think the beauty of coral reefs lies in the diversity of their species. There's corals and anemones and other invertebrates that compete for light and other resources in this kind of beautiful dance. Coral reefs are crucial to the health of the ocean as a whole, because although they only exist in equatorial regions of our planet in the tropics and cover just 0.2% of the seafloor, they support a quarter of life in the ocean. They also provide food, coastal protection, tourism dollars, and other value to people who rely directly on them. According to the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network, the value of goods and services provided by coral reefs to humans is estimated at $2.7 trillion per year, including $36 billion just in tourism dollars alone. Through all my experiences in the field, I've seen a lot of beauty and wonder, and that has served as an endless muse for my art practice. But I've also experienced severe human-caused threats, and that's something I think about a lot too. It's no secret that climate change is ravaging coral reefs, and scientists have been expecting coral bleaching for many decades, and it's only getting worse. While I was falling in love studying coral reefs in college in Australia back in 2007, I was simultaneously heartbroken to learn of their impending demise. Coral bleaching is a phenomenon that may be familiar to a lot of you, but I explore it a lot in my work. It occurs when corals become stressed by warming sea temperatures caused by climate change and warming events like El Niños. And with climate change, of course, resulting from our fossil fuel use and greenhouse gas emissions that traps the sun's heat within our atmosphere, kind of like a warm blanket over the Earth. Corals that become stressed by warming sea temperatures, it's sort of like an immune response, like getting a fever, and they lose the symbiotic algae called zooxanthellae that live within their tissues and normally photosynthesize to provide an important food source for the coral. So it essentially causes the coral to become sick and starve. Corals can recover from bleaching and reverse the process by being recolonized by zooxanthellae, those tiny algae. But bleaching can also lead to coral death, algal domination, and reef erosion, not to mention the gradual destruction of a complex hideout of countless fish and invertebrate species that live among the corals. So it's sort of like a city going bankrupt and letting its buildings fall apart. The reason I focus so much on coral bleaching in my work is that by bleaching white, corals offer us a really stark and kind of stunning visualization of climate change that I think is something that's often difficult for us to see and understand firsthand, outside of seeing all the scary floods and wildfires and stuff on the news. Corals offer a gentler and more emotional way to see warming that I find very powerful. And luckily, there is some hope for certain coral reef communities and species. Research suggests that if we can reduce the other major threats to coral reefs while we work on reining in climate change, we may be able to protect some of them long enough to adapt to a warmer future. Regulating pollution and overfishing can help a lot, and on a more acute scale, growing artificial coral reefs like this guy is doing here in coral nurseries, or even in captivity, sort of like a Noah's Ark for coral reefs in aquariums around the world, could potentially help bridge that gap. Without our help to eliminate these pressures, leading researchers predict that nearly 100% of coral reefs will be in a rapid and terminal decline by 2050, and they may lose their ecological functionality by the end of this century or sooner. We've lost half of the world's coral reefs since I was born, and I'm 39, so it feels personal to me, and they may cease ecologically to function within my lifetime. So through my art practice, my goal is to highlight these facts as a witness to change. I do hope viewers feel empowered to act while we still can, and we can. But I also know that the future of coral reefs is pretty grim, and the story must be told no matter what. So that's my job. I work full-time as an artist to bring attention to threats to ocean health. This is a photo of my very first large-scale ceramic sculptural coral reef wall installation called Our Changing Seas, A Coral Reef Story. And this work was actually the culmination of my master's thesis in environmental studies at Brown University, where I combined coursework in marine conservation science and policy with thesis credits and a co-advisor in the ceramic studio at the Rhode Island School of Design, or RISD. And it debuted in 2011 here in DC in the lobby of the Herbert C. Hoover Building, which is headquarters for the U.S. Department of Commerce and NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And as a master's candidate in environmental studies at Brown from 2009 to 2011, I interviewed marine researchers and artists inspired by nature about the potential for art to inspire coral reef conservation. And at the same time, I took ceramics classes at RISD and developed a method of constructing enormous and complex sculptural installations in a studio that I rented in Providence, Rhode Island. It's one of those funky warehouses near the train tracks. I knew going into this project that I really wanted to create a masterpiece and something that would be visually stunning and transform a human-made environment, but I had no idea what that actually meant or how to achieve that. So I just used my interview results and I basically started building as many corals as I possibly could out of clay, and I figured out how to put them together afterwards. I don't recommend doing that, by the way. It's really challenging. My resulting work is 15 feet tall. It's about 11 feet wide and nearly 1,500 pounds of ceramic installed on plywood panels that are hung on a steel grid wall structure. And in my vision, it depicts a healthy, vibrant Indo-Pacific coral reef at the lower level, and then it transitions upwards into coral bleaching and then becomes smothered by seaweed towards the top. My Our Changing Seas series has grown and changed a lot in the last 13 years, and this year I actually completed the 8th and 9th works in the Our Changing Seas series. And my goal with this series is to really inspire awareness and policy change for coral reef conservation. It celebrates the exotic beauty of coral reefs while highlighting the human-caused threats they face, namely climate change, ocean acidification, overfishing, and land-based sources of pollution. My process has evolved a ton, as you'll see, and the most logical way is probably to share some big projects in order to talk about kind of what went into each of them, and I will spare you the pain of recounting how those first couple projects went. I've evolved a lot since then. It was really challenging, and I didn't quite know what I was doing yet, but things are different now. Since I do a lot of site-specific commission work for new construction, there's often a lot of planning involved, and it isn't unusual for a project to take 1 or 2 years from proposal through completion. And I'm actually in the middle of one public art project that's going to end up taking 5 years just because there's so many committees involved and approvals, and the fabrication process itself is only going to take like up to 8 months, but the whole thing just takes a long time. So to start into the process portion of my talk, I'll begin with Our Changing Seas 3. The year 2014, when I created this, is when I first focused my designs on elevating coral reefs off the reef with this kind of anti-gravity swirling motif that I came up with. And I think it's a good way to kind of imply that the future of coral reefs is in the balance and kind of floating in the currents. This work was my first to explore this idea through cumulative objects that coalesce into a whole, and it debuted in 2014 at the Tang Museum for an invitational exhibition that I did at my alma mater, Skidmore College. When designing it, I was thinking about the rapid transition that corals throughout the tropics and subtropics are making from healthy, colorful, and diverse to sickened and bleached as a result of climate change, which in my mind puts coral reefs into the eye of the storm. And the design shows healthy corals surrounded by the swirling skeletons, kind of sterile white skeletons of bleached corals swirling like the rotating winds of a cyclone or a hurricane. The curator at the Tang, Rachel Seligman, invited me to create something big, and she gave me a lot of freedom with what exactly I would do with that giant wall that she kind of designated for me in the exhibition. So I came up with this extremely rough sketch. And this was still really early days for me. The learning curve was really steep. So this is the first work where I wanted to actually connect the pieces directly to a wall surface instead of using plywood panels with hooks on them and all kinds of crazy stuff. So there were a lot of firsts with this project. I had never worked with art handlers before to pack or install my work. So it was basically a reinvention of my studio practice through this project. And I learned so much from everyone involved. And I think of this as the kind of official starting point for me as a professional artist. Art Changing Seas 3 has toured around the country a bit, and I'm thrilled at how people of all ages respond to it, especially students. So this is at Virginia MoCA, where I had a solo show in 2016. And in 2022, there's a event planning company called David Stark Design that invited me to reimagine the artwork for an exhibition at the Vacheron Constantin flagship boutique on Madison Avenue in New York. So that was kind of a fun way to reimagine this work and tap into a completely different audience. Now I'll give you a side note on fragility. Hopefully this works. There we go. You may have noticed that I create a lot of really extremely fragile pieces, and that's on purpose. One of the things I realized creating coral reef invertebrates in ceramic is that everyone wants to touch them, just like the real thing. And it almost goes without saying that brittle porcelain anemone tentacles and coral branches break easily if they're improperly handled, similar to the delicate bodies of living coral organisms. So that shared fragility is fundamental to the message of my work. You're obviously not supposed to touch them, but that's kind of the point, right? And rather than being too fragile, it feels essential that the medium of my work be ceramic. So this video shows some fragile pieces that I did as a private commission for my Curiosities series. Some of the best, or I guess worst, technically, advice that I got from a ceramics teacher was that my work was too fragile to be practical. And I felt like he kind of missed the point of my work as fine art and was a little bit stuck in the world of craft and thinking about like function instead of concept. And so I didn't want to be bogged down in practical concerns like that, but it's also important to be able to transport my work around the world and install it safely. So that's been an interesting thing for me to think about. I felt at the time like I was rebelling from that feedback, and this is a good example. This is called Catch of the Day, and this is actually installed here at Hillwood on the wall in the case in the exhibition that you'll see. I'm rebellious, but I'm also a perfectionist. So that rebellion against practical concerns drove me to fine-tune my craftsmanship in a way that retains its fragility but avoids flaws. So handling my work requires respect and care, but not magic. It's possible. So here are some pieces for Art Changing Seas 9, which I'll show you in a bit. But that shipped to Italy earlier this year, so you can see an example of how I pack my work now. These are packing photos from a piece called Oil Drum from my Fossil Fuels series, which recently shipped to a collector in Germany, and Minnesota Street Project in San Francisco helped me pack this work and a lot of the work that I'm doing these days where I'm based. I learned so much from professional art handlers, and every time they come to my studio to pack my work, I feel like I learned something new. They really are artists in their own right, and it's truly amazing how many techniques they have for bracing fragile ceramic pieces and cushioning objects from every direction without applying too much pressure. So no packing peanuts allowed, ever, or bubble wrap. Following my solo show at Virginia MoCA in 2016, I was approached by curator Virginia Shore, who was the head curator at the State Department's Office of Art and Embassies, and her co-curator, Claire D'Alba, to propose a truly humongous wall relief for the new U.S. Embassy in Jakarta, Indonesia, that opened in 2018. So that's another 2-year project. This is what I came up with. It's called Confluence, Our Changing Seas 5, and it's the second largest work I've done to date. You can see how big it is. That's me sitting at the bottom. It's about 28 feet high above the plinth and about 18 feet wide. And we installed it in October 2018 as part of the permanent collection at the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta. As you can see, I like to work big. And I think that the idea of one small person and a woman creating such immense, intricately detailed, kind of muscular sculptural works hopefully causes viewers to realize just how big the problem facing coral reefs is, but also how important reefs are to me, and to become curious enough to learn about how the ocean is important to them. At its heart, Confluence celebrates my favorite aesthetic aspects of healthy, diverse, colorful coral reefs. And as I mentioned, it's possible for coral reefs to recover, or I don't know if I mentioned it yet in this talk, but corals can actually recover from bleaching if the stressor, the temperature, gets back to normal quickly enough. So that's something that I want viewers to be able to interpret either optimistically or pessimistically, swirling inward or outward. And this is a detail shot of the finished work on the wall at the embassy. I really wanted the viewer to be drawn into the diversity of textures and forms and colors and the detail, and for them to kind of feel the way I do when I'm hovering over a coral reef in the wild, and to become curious enough to learn more about how reefs are important to them individually. Because I think we protect what we care about, and we care about what we know and understand and feel a connection to. My design and building process has evolved rapidly between projects, but since this was still back in 2016, it was a steep learning curve again. I've become increasingly meticulous, and I measure really carefully and decide where every single piece of hardware is going to go up on the wall before I ever start building a single piece. So I did a hand-drawn sketch for Confluence out of just pen and ink and colored pencil, and then I put it into Photoshop and kind of overlaid it onto an architectural rendering from the embassy contractor team in this case. And then I basically make a giant scale map. So measurements show where everything fits together like a big 3-dimensional puzzle, basically. And in this case, horizontal lines in this map correspond to the white lines that you can see here on the floor of my studio. So for this project, I cut out a paper footprint for each of the numbered pieces that corresponded to my sketch. And I have a much more advanced way of doing this now, which I'll show you in a minute. But back in 2017, 2018, when I was creating Confluence, I was still hand drawing full-scale floor maps. And I hadn't started using giant printed templates yet, so it's very labor-intensive. The design was so big that only half of it would fit on my studio floor at a time, so I had to build the work in 2 sections. And this is the lower half in progress on my studio floor in my old studio in Los Angeles. Starting from the middle out, I really wanted to convey a sense of swirling, floating motion in the work. And so I built each piece in relation to its neighbors and continued forms and directions from one to the next to kind of imply that sense of motion. And in this case, there were 404 individual pieces. I coil build hollow forms from a nice gritty, bulky stoneware clay, and I handcraft each branch and texture using simple tools to sculpt and texture each piece, often poking thousands of holes to represent the repetitive growth of coral colonies. So this is sped up, but you can imagine. After each piece has had time to dry completely, I fire them in my electric kilns. And I'm mindful of energy use, and I'm grateful to live in a city where I can actually opt to pay for renewable energy-based utilities. So that's something I'm trying to be mindful of in terms of producing my work. Individual pieces are then finished and fired using a color palette of glazes that I've developed to reflect the vibrant tones and textures of healthy marine invertebrate communities, and they're often juxtaposed against white glazes to emphasize the stark contrast of coral bleaching that I was talking about. And once each piece is glazed and fired, for Confluence, I reassembled them on the floor of my studio to make sure that everything fit together onto my big 3D puzzle floor map. And I marked on the floor where each piece of hardware was fitted to the back of each piece so that we would know exactly where to put it on the wall when we got there. And final measurements, everything was ready to be packed. Confluence, this work took me about a year to complete with the help of one assistant and my husband and my mom at times. Nowadays I try to have more help when I can, when I have a big project, but this was still early days of figuring that process out. And then we had an amazing art handling company called Atelier 4 come and pack the work for the big trip to Indonesia. And at the US Embassy in Jakarta, we had a great team of art handlers from DC, actually, who helped install the work over the course of about 9 days. And it was very technical. We had tandem scissor lifts, which was a lot of fun. I love a good scissor lift. And the installation was pretty intense and complicated just because of the scale. And especially because I didn't have a full-scale template, so we actually had to measure out where every single piece of hardware went on the wall and mark it onto the wall before we started hanging things. And then people would come out from the cafeteria and try to talk to us, so it was, it was a whole thing. But it worked out. Indonesia really called to me in 2016 to 2018. I had multiple projects there kind of happening at once. I didn't mention that my husband and I were planning our honeymoon there also during those years. So we had already planned to go diving in Raja Ampat in Indonesia for the first time in 2017. I had this embassy project cooking, and then in 2016, when I was in the middle of proposing the embassy work, I was contacted by a nonprofit called the Coral Triangle Center in Bali. They go by CTC for short. And they contacted me to commission a large-scale ceramic sculptural wall relief for the new Center for Marine Conservation in Bali. And that serves as an educational center for local and tourist visitors. So this photo is from my first visit in 2016. And between 2016 and 2018, this project with the CTC evolved into a community-based initiative that I basically designed and oversaw, but we had a team of over 300 people working on sculpting corals and figuring out this installation. We formed a team with some key kind of local artists and artisans and just a whole bunch of volunteers, and we ended up sculpting over 2,000 ceramic coral pieces for the installation. There was also a ceramics factory called Jengala that was local that donated some of their time and resources to create some of the pieces. So this is during a workshop with the director of the CTC and her family called Anemone Day. We had lots of anemone days, actually. They were a favorite. And I'm really proud to have been part of this project and have visited Bali 5 times during that time to lead workshops and select glazes and work with the architect and contractors to figure out the mechanics of this installation. And then that was all pre-Zoom too, so we were on Skype and it was intense. But over a year of workshops and weekly Skype calls, it took us about 12 days to install the work with a team of myself and our local lead artist, Rico Gabriel, and a few other key project team members. And the installation process was pretty labor-intensive. We ended up installing about 2,000 ceramic coral pieces onto a masonry wall. So I don't know how many of you have tried to permanently attach fragile ceramic to stuccoed brick, but it takes forever. It's pretty challenging. This is a panorama image We finished the work in September 2018, just in time for the Our Oceans conference in Bali. And this is the work. It's about 61 feet long, and it's called Semesta Terumbu Karang, which means coral universe in Indonesian. And here's a wide-angle shot that I took of our local lead artist, Rico Gabriel, who was instrumental in pulling off the huge project. And it's still there today, so if you're ever in Bali, you can go visit. This is the central kind of bullseye, or the heart of the design. And then the US ambassador to Indonesia at the time, Joseph Donovan, was in town for the Our Ocean conference, and he really considered the work a form of cultural diplomacy to highlight how the US and Indonesia can work together to help protect coral reefs. So we did a press conference with CNN Indonesia and some other outlets. And then not long after those huge projects finished up, there's a curator at the Florence Griswold Museum named Dr. Jenny Parsons, who invited me to be part of an exhibition that she was organizing called Fragile Earth. And that opened at the Florence Griswold Museum in Connecticut in 2019. Mark Dion, Jennifer Angus, and James Prosek were the three other artists included in that exhibition. And she challenged me to create a big wall work to debut at that show. Something kind of, she gave me a lot of freedom, and I had something pretty ominous in mind. So this is Malum Geminos. It means evil twins in Latin. And it's a homage to one of my mentors and a friend named Dr. Jane Lubchenco, who in 2009 made a statement at the UN climate talks in Copenhagen, where she referred to ocean acidification as the equally evil twin of climate change affecting coral reefs. And ocean acidification causes carbon dioxide emissions, or it's caused by carbon dioxide emissions dissolving into the sea and making the ocean more acidic. So in this work, bleached corals branch horizontally in a book-matched pattern across the gallery wall, and clusters of gelatinous white polyps appear to have had their supportive skeletons kind of dissolved by acidic seawater. And I was thinking about the skeletal nature of coral reefs also, because Dr. Lubchenco also made a profound comparison to ocean acidification as osteoporosis of the sea. So I thought that was interesting. Today, that work is included in a touring fashion retrospective for the designer Iris van Herpen, and it's called Sculpting the Senses, and it was curated by Chloé Petiot and Louise Curtis for the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, MAD Paris, which is next door to the Louvre, so that was really fun to go there and install. And hopefully, there we go. This is the installation process. The exhibition is currently on the move. This was when we installed it at the Queensland Museum Australia's Gallery of Modern Art in Queensland, and it's currently on the move to the Art Science Museum in Singapore. So it'll open there in March 2025. But this is where we were installing it in Queensland earlier this year in June. And in this video, you're seeing about 2.5 days of work, beginning with hanging the template, which shows where every piece of hardware attached to the wall. And then this piece has a lot of components that have negative space within the form. So I had to use 2 pieces of hardware on many of the components instead of just one single bracket. So hanging the pieces is pretty challenging because you have to measure exactly to make sure it's all hung perfectly. When I was building Malum Geminos, I found it helpful to start from the central line and kind of build outwards. And so the piece looks very symmetrical, but if you look too closely, it's not exactly symmetrical. In March 2020, days before everything shut down for the pandemic, I flew to a remote shipyard in Norway to install this 2-part work in the reception area of Lindblad Expedition's National Geographic Endurance Polar Expedition vessel as part of a permanent ship-based exhibition called Change, which is curated by artist Zaria Foreman, who also does a lot of climate work. These are the sketches I created for this pair of wall works. I was looking for inspiration under the ice in Svalbard. It's not tropical, but there are actually benthic invertebrate communities that are really colorful with anemones and tunicates and soft corals and sponges kind of growing among one another and undulating in the icy currents. So I designed a pair of mandalas to celebrate that beauty. And here's a video that is not sped up. This is the one non-time-lapse video that shows you how slowly I go when I'm building. I'm usually a little bit faster than this, but it gives you a sense of how long I sit in the studio listening to podcasts and too much NPR. The final result is a pair of ceramic sculptural works that we installed directly onto the wall under custom acrylic domes that are to protect guests when they're walking around on the ship and crossing Drake's Passage, hopefully not bumping into anything. And so it's in the reception area near the windows on the ship. And the ship goes to explore Svalbard, Norway's unique ecosystem. So I like people to think about what's below the ice. I stayed really busy during the pandemic, actually, and I had back-to-back, sometimes overlapping projects, so I was working the entire lockdown, and including others in public and hospitality settings. I did this one for a hotel called the Seabird Resort in Oceanside, California. This is our Changing Seas 7. And the Oceanside Museum of Art actually curated the art collection for this hotel, which is part of the Hyatt group, and they commissioned me to create the swirling wall relief on the wall behind the reception desk in the hotel. So here's a detail from below. This is sort of like if you fall down behind the reception desk, I guess. But there's a colorful, vibrant core of healthy corals again, and then it has that transition to bleached corals kind of around the periphery. And there's also a door incorporated into this work that you can see, so that was kind of a fun challenge. This is the sketch, the concept design that I did for our Changing Seas 7, and in this case I ended up using a projector to trace it full scale. This is still from the days before I printed my templates, but this was an advancement because I used a projector to actually put the design full scale on the wall and then trace it onto tracing paper that I can then put down onto the floor and use while I'm building. So that's been really helpful. And then here's a shot of some of the unglazed and bisque-fired work on my studio floor as some of it was drying. Around the same time in 2021, I also completed this other colorful swirling wall work called Revolve. And it's composed of about 250 individual ceramic corals, anemones, and sponges that swirl in this kind of colorful vortex with bleached white corals around the edges. And here's a detail shot of the core of it. It's installed in the seminar room of the Environmental Studies building at Wofford College, which is a liberal arts school in South Carolina. And I created it in the memory of a student there whose parents commissioned it as a gift to the school. So that was a meaningful project, and I hope that when students stare at it during class, they might come up with all kinds of creative ideas to fight climate change and protect the ocean. And this is when Revolve was in progress on the floor of my studio, so you can see the paper template that I traced out for that one. These are some of the core pieces once they were glazed and ready to pack. And then in 2022, I created a private commission for a collector in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, who wanted a vibrant, hopeful work for his family's home on the coast. And so this is a video of me before I began building that work, and it's showing me tracing out the design template full scale using a projector again. And here's the completed work. It's called Gyre. And I took inspiration not only from healthy coral reefs, but perennial flowers and the garden kind of surrounding his home. So that's why the bright colors are a bit more vibrant than what you might see on a natural coral reef. Here's a detail shot of that work when it debuted in a second rendition of the exhibition Fragile Earth that I mentioned before, and this was at the Brandywine Museum of Art in Pennsylvania. I've done some other residential commissions in the past few years. This one is called Fisher's Gyre, and it's installed in a collector's home on Fisher's Island. So that's in the Long Island Sound in New York. That's where they filmed Moonrise Kingdom, and it really feels like it. It's a pretty cool place. But it was a fun way to branch out a bit and explore more temperate ecology and take inspiration from local oyster beds and seagrass meadows and the rocky intertidal marine life of the area. And I created here's a detail shot. I created it last year when my husband was in Boston for a fellowship, and so I rented a studio out there where I created it. And there's just so many hundreds of pieces in this one. It's about 1,135 individual pieces with stoneware and porcelain like branches and clusters installed on the wall, each with a single nail that is stuck into a pilot hole in the wall with some museum wax. So here's a time lapse of us installing it. And I've skipped a bunch of projects in between, but that brings us to this past year, which has honestly been the busiest time of my career. It's been absolutely nuts, and I can't really believe everything that's happened. This feels like what I do every day. I'm just like constantly building coral. But I made these videos while I was creating a new work called Our Changing Seas 8, which is the largest work that I've made to date, and it's about 31 feet tall. It's gigantic, but I can't show you any pictures of the finished work because it's top secret in a building in California. And it was installed in April of this year, but at least I have these time-lapse videos to show you of building the work. And I'm hoping to get photos of it eventually. I enjoy working with design-build teams of engineers and architects and contractors, designers, art handlers to create permanent installations in public spaces and workplaces. And it just so happens they're often in earthquake zones, so there's a lot of technical engineering considerations that have to go into this. But ceramics as an art medium, as some of you probably know, is full of troubleshooting and eyeballing, and that must be partly why it's so often put in the category of craft instead of fine art. But I feel like there's so many examples of how those gaps are bridged. And the troubleshooting never goes away, of course, but over time I've worked really hard to have both exceptional craftsmanship, but also push the boundaries in the medium, both conceptually and technically, so that I can defy gravity and create these really large-scale works. So in some of these videos, you can see how I coil build hollow forms, and they're more lightweight than you might think. They're only about ½ an inch thick in a lot of places, and I texture each piece by hand. So on the floor here, you can see this printed vinyl template that I made for this large-scale installation. And so that's been kind of a magical breakthrough where I created a full-scale vinyl template that I could then hang on the wall to install the work, and it would show us where every single piece of hardware goes. So that saves a ton of time. And in some of these, you can also see how I incorporate the bright white pieces are actually porcelain that are bisque fired and stuck into the wet stoneware clay as I'm building. And the stoneware that I use only shrinks about 5%, so it tolerates having pre-fired clay kind of inserted into that, and ceramic people are often kind of surprised by being able to do that, but it actually works pretty well. Our Changing Seas 8 was a commission for a design studio called SPM Design. So these are the mock-ups that I created for it, and it actually wraps around the corner of 2 adjoining walls and stretches over 30 feet high and about 18 feet wide. So that video is really just a taste of what we did. This is Our Changing Seas 9, which is my most recent work in the Our Changing Seas series, and it was a special project for the new Christian Dior couture boutique in Capri in Italy. And that opened on Via Camarel earlier this year. It was commissioned along with another work in the adjoining room called Capri Gyre, and it stretches across 2 doors, which you can barely see in this photo. But that was a fun challenge because one of them is a dressing room. And creating this pair, here's a kind of detailed video of Capri Gyre. It was a really fun project for me because I got to work with the Dior architectural team and have my work included in the Christian Dior Couture art collection. And that brings us here to Hillwood. Interconnectedness is a major theme that I explore in a lot of my work, and I mentioned at the beginning that we're all connected to the sea, and that relates to this work, Aqueduct, that's here in the exhibition. It takes kind of a playful, surrealist look at that idea of interconnectedness with a site-sensitive installation that takes shape in different forms depending on where it's installed. So it looks a little bit different here than it has in the past. Sometimes it's really elongated. This is the original version of the installation that I did during my solo show at Virginia Mocha in 2016. And it's kind of a playful, ominous exploration of sea level rise and species migrations caused by climate change, with hundreds of porcelain and stoneware corals and anemones and sponges and other marine invertebrates kind of spilling into the gallery from a hand-carved porcelain air duct register that I made by hand. So it's all ceramic. And here's a quick install video that I did of Aqueduct. When I created it, I was thinking about what might happen in a surrealist sort of way when climate change causes tropical sea creatures to migrate towards the poles and kind of invade human spaces as seawater warms and sea levels rise. So kind of asking the question, will we act urgently to halt climate change and keep the ocean in its place, or will we allow the sea to consume us? When I was doing my master's thesis research about art for coral reef conservation back in 2010, I interviewed an award-winning ecologist and author in New York named Carl Safina. And he told me, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, do what you can uniquely do to make a difference, to help protect and restore the ocean. And I think that's a really empowering idea. So I took that idea to heart, to do what I can uniquely do, to visualize climate change through the fragile beauty of marine life. And I feel like I'm creating monuments in honor of coral reefs. Some days I worry that I might be making memorials to them, but I really hope not. And I feel like I'm just getting started. So I hope that this work will continue to grow and change and inspire greater levels of support for ocean conservation, and we'll see climate change slow and life in the ocean recover. I think nature really can heal itself if we let it, and we know how. There are so many solutions that can happen all at once, like prioritizing renewable energy, reducing global meat consumption, educating women, voting at the ballot and with our dollars to do things on a much greater scale. So it's going to take all those kinds of creative and innovative solutions all at once. So I'll just ask, what will you choose to do? Thank you. And I'll be happy to answer questions. We have a microphone that I believe will be passed around. There we go.
That's what I was going to say.
Okay, thank you.
I'll say there's only one of you. Do you need like 100 of us to help you? Because I
Yeah,
could make
come
those
over.
little dots.
Come make tentacles for me. I love tentacle helpers.
And do you prioritize like doing a work for Christian Dior that might not be seen by as many people as some of your beautiful museum installations? Being that you are just you, how do you make those decisions?
I always try to get good images of my work because it's so limited in terms of who can see work in person in different places around the world. So that's a big priority that I have, is making sure that I can get good photos and share them online and use that as another way to kind of increase or amplify the message. Thank you.
And piggybacking on that question, your work is just awe-inspiring. I'm practically speechless, and anyone who knows me knows I'm never speechless. But what I wonder about is sort of that business development aspect. You have Dior, you have Nat Geo, hotels, Paris. Are you solo in outreach, or do people come to you? Is it a combo? And where next?
Where next? I represent myself, so I do respond and negotiate contracts, and I I have a lawyer who helps me, but I do a lot of it myself. So I really enjoy that part of business management. I think a lot of artists don't feel like that part comes naturally, but for me, I'm lucky that I enjoy kind of navigating that stuff. So I try to make sure that I'm prioritizing projects that give me a lot of artistic license and help me kind of spread the message of my work in surprising places and audiences. And I have some exciting, kind of a lot of secret projects these days for some reason, but they, come out like the Christian Dior Couture project was really fun, and that was one that I just announced recently, but it was finished in April, for example. So there's all kinds of things that roll out. I am collaborating with a chocolate company so I'm going to start designing some pastries that look like my work that will come out at some point. Microphone.
Hi, I'm a climate scientist by day and a potter in the evening. So I have maybe an annoying question, which is, how do you grapple with the embodied emissions in your materials? Like, do you source them from anywhere in particular?
Mm-hmm.
And I know you addressed like that you use probably like a low fire electric kiln for your work,
Mm-hmm.
but in the materials themselves.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about that a lot because I do want to be mindful and walk the walk, obviously, and try to make sure that my materials are sourced responsibly. So I buy all my clay locally from a factory that produces it in California, so it's not shipped too far. A lot of my glazes are the same situation, so I think it's impossible to have zero footprint, but I do make sure that my kilns are as full as possible when I fire them, for example. I try to reduce my water use in all kinds of ways. I never throw away clay. I always recycle it. So there are a lot of things that I do in my studio and lifestyle just to keep it as sustainable as possible. But I also always think it's important to highlight when I get this question, because I do a lot, how responsible corporations and policymakers are for making a huge difference in climate change and emissions, but also making individuals feel guilty for our own very relatively tiny contributions to that same problem. So I do want to emphasize how we need to all be urging corporations and policymakers to prioritize renewable energy and climate solutions.
I think we have time for one more question. Beth, did you have a? Yeah. Sorry, we need the microphone because this is being recorded.
Okay. I think you talked about it a little bit, but I wanted to ask what the nexus was between your activism and your art. When did you first realize that was your mission to meld those? When did that first come to you, and what was your process?
That's a good question. I really did have a turning point when I started out, all the stuff from high school and college where I was just sculpting corals out of a personal fascination. I didn't realize the power of that yet. And then when I was in Australia a few years after that, I saw really, really advanced coral bleaching firsthand. I saw just like a huge thicket of bleached corals as far as I could see. And that moment really made me realize that I had to use the voice and the skills that I have to make a difference and spread that message to people that can't put their faces below the surface and see what's actually going on down there. So I think I always knew there was some way to impact people's emotions, but that was the impetus for me to really dive in, if you will, and focus my work on that kind of advocacy.